The Hisense 116UX is not only the most expensive TV, but also the largest one I have ever reviewed, coming in, as you might expect, at 116 inches, sporting a 4K 165Hz plus VRR VA panel with 3,584 RGB zones, although don't be fooled, you could technically, I guess, triple that because each one is individually apparently addressable. And it also comes with their new HiView AI Engine X processor, supports Dolby Vision, HDR10, and HLG, and coming in at a price of $24,999.99. You can't leave those pennies on the table. Well, with a 2-year parts and labor warranty, that is a huge ask for a huge TV. And the question is, does it deliver huge picture quality to make it worth those smackaroos? Well, I actually got flown out, disclaimer, by Hisense to New York recently to test the 116UX. And yes, I brought a ton of tools with me and spent way too much time. In fact, they had to kick me out at the end to try and bring you guys this review. So let's jump into it. This is an insane TV, and yes, in a lot of ways, it also brings you insane picture quality, thanks in part to their brand new RGB Mini LED backlight system, which promises to deliver far better color and perceptually less blooming in a lot of cases, thanks to it not just being white light being pushed through. No, it's actually going to be giving you full color, which does mean, yes, the color performance in selective HDR content should be far greater than any mini LED that's ever been released before. And this is the first of the new generation of mini LEDs that will be hitting the market, probably most of them next year, that is going to be the largest step for mini LED we've seen in a very long time. And let's start off by talking about that with the color. So in terms of the color, I mean, does the RGB Mini LED backlight system truly deliver? And I think it really depends on the content, because look, most of the content that I had access to on YouTube simply has not been graded to even fully take advantage of the insane 95% BT 2020 coverage that's being claimed on the 116UX. So you are going to have to actually go out of your way to look for content that has been graded for not only really bright HDR, but also you got to make sure it's actually taking advantage of the full BT 2020 color range, as a lot of content out there is still DCI-P3, which is a smaller color gamut, and in those situations, you may not notice a huge improvement on the 116UX, and most of the content I was viewing was that, even the special HDR content that I was searching for. Now, it did definitely look better, but it wasn't the massive leap that I was expecting, as I simply didn't have enough content to even take full advantage of this display. But let me tell you, in the few instances in which it was actually visible, it was visible. There is a big leap in terms of the color performance between the 116UX and something like Hisense's last generation 98UX, which uses the traditional mini LED backlight system. And I am going to be comparing these two quite a bit throughout this review, because these two TVs have, at least in my testing, similar amounts of firing mini LED backlight systems at around 3,500 is what I'm counting. But in the case of the 116UX, they're RGB, and in the 98UX, well, they're the traditional older style mini LEDs. So it's a very interesting comparison. So yes, there is a big jump in terms of color on the 116UX versus the 98UX if you can take advantage of it. But speaking of HDR content, let's talk about the brightness. And yes, I didn't have a chance to run my Calman results as I couldn't bring enough tools to make that happen, so you'll have to excuse me on this one. But I can tell you in terms of accuracy, real quick before we get into brightness, it did to me look, if you threw it into the filmmaker mode, like they have been paying attention to the accuracy. Nothing looked massively blown out. There weren't major issues to my eye in terms of the gamma tracking or color performance, anything like that. However, do keep in mind, of course, nothing's ever gonna be perfect, but Hisense's track record with my recent reviews is that they have actually been tracking in Calman very well, and I would expect no different out of a premium 116UX. But in any case, back to the brightness, does this thing deliver in terms of HDR impact? And my answer is yes. It is insanely bright, and in fact, in some ways, this is the brightest TV I have ever seen, but it really depends on the content. For example, I did actually go ahead and measure the peak window brightness brightness at the D65 white point, and yes, the Hisense 116UX is the brightest TV I have ever measured, coming in at over 7,000 nits in a 10% window and over 1,200 nits in a 100% window. The next brightest that I've ever seen was the TCL 𝗚M851G, and it's absolutely slaughtering that TV in these window brightness tests, which is extremely impressive. However, in terms of real content, I can tell that Hisense is pulling back just a bit, likely to try and preserve as much contrast as they can, which when you pair that with the VA panel does lead to some really excellent looking images when you look at the TV straight on. And I honestly think that that's probably the best move, considering that most content isn't going to be reaching over 8,000 or 7,000 nits anyway. However, just keep that in mind, as in terms of real HDR content, I actually don't think it's the brightest TV I've ever seen. And in fact, in some cases, and it could just be the simple contrast of OLED itself, but TVs like the LG G5, which is an OLED and not a mini LED, still to this day, and the Bravia 2 and the S95F, those three TVs give me perceptually more punch than any other TV that I've seen in terms of HDR. And I still have the LG G5 since I wasn't able to run my game test on the Hisense 116UX. The G5 is still technically my leader for the brightest HDR display in real world content. Based on what I saw with the 116UX, I suspect the 116UX would be around or maybe slightly under the G5 in some moments, but when you get to really bright full screen moments, well, then that's where something like the 116UX will absolutely clobber something like the LG G5 OLED. So again, it really depends on the content, but either way, I do think the 116UX would make an excellent bright room TV. It put out some images that were insanely bright if you completely unleash it and let it do its thing with dynamic tone mapping. And between that and the color, honestly, it's gonna far exceed the HDR, even mastering capabilities of most of the content out there. It should be displaying everything as the creator intended, and I don't think you're gonna be able to find a single piece of HDR content out there that this thing is gonna have problems with. It is absolutely wild. But what about the motion interpolation and motion performance? Is this a strength or weakness for this display? Well, here's what I will tell you. I do think that Hisense has been making some pretty big improvements to their motion interpolation as of late, thanks in part to reviewer feedback, and here's where it seems to be paying off. The 116UX did seem like it was roughly around the type of motion performance that I'm used to seeing on the 98UX, maybe just a little tiny bit behind, but that's actually not a bad thing, because the 98UX, when I first reviewed that, started out with some pretty major problems and finally got to a good place. Well, the 116UX is starting out in a good place. It has pretty good motion interpolation with not too many artifacts or major soap opera effect that I could view, while still eliminating judder pretty effectively. In fact, the 116UX here, I think, is one of the better displays that I've seen in terms of its motion interpolation based on my limited hands-on time with the unit I had access to. Now, that being said, the motion performance for gaming is a bit of a letdown, unfortunately, because they're using a VA panel and not the ADS Pro, as that simply wasn't going to be possible at this size. Well, you can see that there is some noticeable trailing behind the UFO in this test. And when you compare it to something like the LG G5 at 165 Hz, the same refresh rate, well, that one looks a whole lot better in motion than the 116UX. And even TCL's last generation 𝗚M751G has better motion performance than the 116UX. And look, when it comes to mini LED, there's always going to be some sort of a compromise. And here, they had to make the compromise of motion performance to give you better contrast. And yes, this does have really excellent contrast, and I think for most viewers, that's probably going to be more important. Now, don't get me wrong, at 165 Hz for gaming, this will be pretty good, and the latency did seem very low to me. However, is it going to be the best gaming display on the market? Well, if you're looking for the largest TV, the answer is yes. If you're looking for the best TV in terms of latency and motion, well, probably not, no. So it's really gonna depend on what you're looking for. Now, as for the text clarity and subpixel layout, it comes with a blue, green, red subpixel layout, so you are gonna get very good clarity overall, but it's not gonna be perfect, as some applications will prefer red, green, blue, as that's traditionally what's expected. Now, as for the finish and the perceived clarity, it's going to be absolutely excellent. I mean, not only does this thing come with a glossy coating that leads to super crisp and clear visuals, the likes of which a matte coating could never hope to compete compete with, which is awesome for viewing really any type of content, but also that glossy coating does have some sort of ambient light rejecting properties, which means you can put this in a bright room and black is still gonna look pretty black. You're not gonna have a whole lot of issues with raised shadow detail like you do on QD OLED, which is excellent, but you will notice there are gonna be some direct reflections that are visible in the display. Look, you can't fight physics, you gotta make a compromise somewhere. Here's where they chose to do it, and I agree with their approach. However, one thing that I don't agree with is VA's viewing angles. Unfortunately, yes, because they're not using an ADS Pro panel, not only is the motion worse, but the other compromise is that the viewing angles do also get worse. Now, they have applied some sort of film to the display to make the viewing angles better, and it certainly does seem to be working. Don't get me wrong, the viewing angles, they're not terrible. They're pretty decent overall, but they don't hold up to the viewing angles on something like the 98UX, which is the previous flagship aside from the 110UX, so it's a bit unfortunate to see that there's a step back when it comes to the viewing angles. It's not bad, but at an angle you will notice a slight loss in terms of contrast as well as color, and that's just something that isn't as noticeable on an ADS Pro panel. Now, thankfully, one other big improvement they made was to the sound. I did notice some pretty major issues on my 98UX with the sound out of the box, and some tuning made it much better, and it looks like they've done a much better job on the tuning with the 116UX. It has pretty good sound overall. There's no major issues, and honestly, it's better than most TVs that I've heard, although it does lack a bit of clarity. So as always, if you're investing in a super expensive TV, yes, it will always be improved with a super awesome sound system as well. Thankfully, I also ran into no issues. The menu and firmware was awesome, and in fact, this is the fastest TV I've ever seen by quite some margin when it comes to navigating those menus. This processor is no joke. It is honestly just such a great experience to use the TV with how responsive it is, and also I didn't see any major flicker or other problems like that. So what do I think about the 116UX? Well, I'll tell you this much. It's probably, in a lot of ways, the best mini LED TV money can buy. And in some ways, it could be considered the best TV in general money could buy. I mean, it's insanely bright, it has less noticeable blooming, more pure colors, and excellent clarity. However, that doesn't mean it's perfect. At roughly $25,000 right now, well, this TV is just wildly expensive and far out of reach for most buyers. And quite frankly, although the new backlight system is certainly a step up, in my opinion, it's a bit more iterative than I expected, since most content doesn't even take full advantage of the new incredible color performance yet. And the 116UX actually takes a step back in terms of motion performance and viewing angles, which for gaming or if you're seating people at a significant angle to the TV, this certainly stings. And since it's not a straight upgrade in every single respect versus previous TVs like the 98UX, well, that $25,000 price is a tough pill to swallow. But at the end of the day, there's really nothing that compares to this TV. So again, in some ways, it could be considered the best TV money can buy. So if you're looking for the biggest, brightest, most colorful TV that I've probably ever seen, well, I'll have affiliate links in the description below, but just be aware, it's gonna cost you a pretty penny. Whether you're looking to connect a new console, gaming PC, or just need a fast and reliable HDMI cable to connect over long distances, RuPro has you covered with their certified 8K HDMI 2.1 fiber optic cable, available in sizes up to 50 feet and can deliver a perfect full 48 gigabits per second connection over distances other cables could only dream of reaching. And now RuPro is offering a new detachable and upgradable pure fiber cable that sends the same 48 gigabits per second signal through its ultra thin and flexible housing, making it easier to route through walls. So if you're in the market for a cable that can drive a beautiful new TV or monitor, be sure to check out RuPro on Amazon today.